Hello and good evening. Welcome to October's edition of our virtual Critical Dialogue. My name is Shakira Dramat and I am the Critical Dialogue Coordinator here at Cornerstone. Most of the times I am behind the scenes and not often on camera. You may have seen my face once or twice. But this evening I have the incredible honor of firstly introducing our panelists, but also to tell you a little bit about our Reclaiming Agency program, which is a culmination of the year's critical dialogues. This year's Reclaiming Agency program will take place from the 26th to the 28th of November. The events are free to attend to the public, and we are exploring leadership as a mechanism to reclaim our futures. So far this year, we've had the opportunity to explore, discuss, and dialogue around a range of incredible and important topics. We've looked at the effect of COVID-19 on youth. We've looked at food security in South Africa, particularly during hard lockdown. We've looked at whether or not internet access should be a human right. We've looked at the effects of COVID-19 on private higher education. And of course, in September, we had an incredible celebration of South African heritage and culture, which is a really great way for us to get into the Reclaiming Agency program, because we also celebrated our 50 years of existence, which is what we'll be doing at the end of Reclaiming Agency with the big 50th anniversary concert. So like I said, this year we'll be exploring leadership as a mechanism to reclaim our futures, and we'll be looking at leadership in all its aspects. Leadership within business, leadership within communities, schools, leadership in activism, and also we have some great workshops on how you can be a better leader. So I do encourage you to keep an eye out on our social media platforms, to subscribe to our newsletter on our website if you haven't already done that, as this is how you'll be informed about our upcoming Reclaiming Agency program. Once again, the dates for your reference is 26 to 28 November. And so now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our incredible facilitator for this evening, Martina, who will be facilitating our discussion around activism then and now. Martina is the founder and director of RA Digital and has a long-standing career in South African media, television, and film. Her expertise lie in the media and advocacy space, where she's won awards for her filmmaking. She also served as national leadership of SASPO and took part in student activism in the late 80s and early 90s. Martina successfully led strategic communications campaigns for South African provincial and national government departments, and is a surviving whistleblower of the Parliament administration during the fateful 2015 year. This makes Martina the perfect person to facilitate this discussion. And so with that, I hand over to you, Martina.
Thank you very much, Shakila. And what an honor and what an amazing panel that joins me this evening. And looking forward to the value that's going to be added by all of us in this. And I want to emphasize intergenerational dialogue, which implies that some of us are from different generations to others, and we'll find out which generations we belong to and what our experiences are. But I suppose I'll start by saying I'm from the older generation, the late 80s, early 90s. And I'd like to introduce Zenaria Barnes, who's at the bottom right of the screen, as you can see. Zenaria is a child of the Cape, a child of the 80s, an 80s activist, for those of you who would have grown up on the Cape Flats in Cape Town, you would know that the Cape Flats was the epicenter of the South African mass democratic movement in the UDF, and this is the world that Zenaria grew up in and comes from. She is working currently at the Community Chest of the Western Cape, and she's responsible for driving the establishment of the Sediba Global Partnership Office. She has a strong passion for the development of arts and is a founding member of the Cape Cultural Collective. Historically, Zenaria was the chief of staff at Independent Media, and this is where she has a strong connection with the media world and has served on both corporate and non-profit boards. She's also served as the head of investigations at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that contextualizes the kind of role that she's played, both at the activism level, the transition level of this country, and beyond, and the development phase of this country. Before the TRC, she was a researcher at the Education Policy Unit at the University of the Western Cape, where she conducted research into post-apartheid higher education policy. So that's an area. Our next panelist is Mr. Garda. I'm just looking for your profile. Shakil, welcome. The man at the table this evening. Shakil is a prominent voice within the political Twitter space. He is currently a student activist from the University of the Witwatersrand. He's a media personality in his own right and serves as student leader in various positions, including president of the Muslim Students Association Union. And currently, Shakil is studying law and hosts his own show on Salam Media. And we'll hear more about him. And I suppose that contextualizes which generation you're from, Shakil. And I look forward to hearing more about your activism and the use of media. I'm reunited this evening by my sister Siam Samai, who's the director of the Women's Legal Center. Siam is a feminist lawyer, activist, and the current director of the Women's Legal Center, a very important organization that provides kind of access to legal resources for women. She holds a BProc and LLM degree in constitutional litigation from UWC, and serves on various national, provincial, and community structures, providing either strategic leadership, provincial, legal, programmatic, or organizational support. She's a long-serving board member and chairperson of Lawyers for Human Rights, and has served on the Rural Legal Trust and the Association of University Legal Aid Institutions and Trusts. So a long career in rights and aid, and bringing the legal profession to communities. She's an active member and the vice chairperson of the Western Cape branch of the National Association of Democratic Lawyers, NADEL, which is a long-standing organization of progressive legal practitioners, and was elected in 2018 as the National Gender Convener and serves on its NEC. She also serves as an executive member of the South African Women Lawyers Association within the Western Cape. And last, and definitely not least, we're very pleased to have Omhle Nchingala, who's the former deputy president of the SRC at Wits University in that spicy, difficult year, 2015, which is where this country got its wake-up call with the Fees Must Fall movement rising. Especially my generation got a wake-up call, Omhle, and I have some difficult questions to pose to us, the older lot, about whether we could have seen it coming and whether we did enough. But you can also challenge us. We are here to have this conversation. Omhle is currently a master's candidate in development studies at Wits University. She's an anthropologist whose work is based on gender, memory, and economic justice on the African continent. Her passion for justice led her to be part of the Fees Must Fall and rural youth development movements in northern KZN. She's also co-founded a small business podcast, Leranzo Africa, and is co-author of the Fees Must Fall book, edited by Susan Boyson. She also founded the Dundee Youth Forum, which focuses on raising young leaders in Northern KZN. So thank you very much, all of you, for sharing this platform with me. I'm humbled and honored. And I'm going to hand over to Zenaria to have to make her opening statement for this evening.
Good evening, everyone, Martina, fellow panelists and audience. And thank you to Cornerstone for the opportunity and the invitation to speak this evening. We have 5 minutes to do an opening. And in prepping, I realized it was useless because when I studied sort of how long I was speaking, I was way over the 5 minutes. I'm going to depend on you, Martina, to cut me when I need to be cut. So I'll start with my personal journey in relation to how I came to activism. And it was as a young girl, a 16-year-old young woman, a high school student at Harold Cressy High School. And what shaped me was the influence of my parents, particularly my late dad, Sadiq Barnes, who had been a primary school teacher and principal, and also emerged out of the unity movement, as well as my teachers at Harold Cressy High School, where I matriculated from in 1979. Another important factor were the struggles that were happening in the 70s in other parts of the world, including Nicaraguan revolution, which, the Sandinista movement came to power in 1979. We were very inspired as young women by the Sandinista, the women in particular, Dora Teles, and there were struggles in Zimbabwe. As you know, in 1980, Zimbabwe gained its independence, and historical struggles and revolutions such as what happened in Russia, in Cuba. And these were all the influences that shaped me. Also in 79, I was drawn into a study group with other students from schools across the Western Cape. And they were from Manenberg, Langa, Guguletu, Athlone, Bonteheuwel, and so on. And we basically studied things like What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, the Communist Manifesto. We read banned literature from the ANC, the African Communists. We had all these kinds of discussions. And in 1979, we started meeting as students. In fact, it was my first introduction to the University of Western Cape students was at a meeting at Livingston High in 1979, where I met Cecil Eso and other students who then told us to please come to UWC in 1980 because they saw us as young activists. And much to the disdain and disapproval of my parents, I ended up at UWC in 1980. What was important about 79 as well, it was the moment that we actually went into the streets, where it was the year of the Fatties and Monies strike. And we connected with the Food and Canning Workers Union, who were organizing the strike. And as students, we mobilized and a nationwide boycott of the Fatties and Monies spaghetti and other pastas. And I've read recently that it was one of the biggest consumer boycotts that ever happened in South African history. And some tactics involve, for example, filling up a shopping trolley with Fatties and Monies products, going to the till at the supermarket and leaving it behind after refusing to pay. So this was a precursor to 1980. Oh, I forgot to say, in 79 as well, the Super SRC got formed. I recall a meeting at Spesbona. And this was the precursor to the Committee of 81, which essentially organized or sort of was responsible for the organization around the 1980 schools boycott. And then in 1980 was my first year at the university. When the boycott broke out at the high schools in the Western Cape in April of that year, we at the university initially, but we learned quickly that we were still connected to that. And so we mobilized as activists on the campus in 1980, and we were all deployed to our various areas where we came from. So I was from Kensington, Factoryton, and myself and others were deployed into the high schools in both Kensington and Factoryton to meet with the student leadership of that time. And I think what was important is that we soon realized that we needed to actually involve our parents and get their support. So students started organizing mass meetings within communities to get the community support for the 1980 schools boycott. I think today, I'm going to jump to today. Today, my activism is really through the Cape Cultural Collective, of which, as you heard, I'm a founding member and currently chairperson of the board, and also as a person employed at Community Chest. And the activism found its expression during COVID-19 through three, I think, very important publications in relation to conversations around justice, food systems, heritage, and so forth. And the lessons, I suppose, that I learned, and I'm just going to short circuit now because I'm sure my time is up. It was, we built organization. You know, in the 1980s, the last decade before we have our democracy, 1990, Mandela released, 1994, our first democratic election, we built strong organization on the ground in community. We learned about solidarity, supporting worker strikes, supporting the struggles of others in communities. We were intergenerational even at that time. And a word that I heard later was intersectionalism. And I believe that we didn't know that word then, but we were in that kind of process. We learned strong organizational skills. And we also looked at race, but also at class, many of us. And our influences, as I said, were local, very much. What preceded us, the activists that came before us in South Africa, but also universally in other countries. There were women that influenced me. I discovered feminism as well in high school. So women and their role in struggles, Rosa Luxemburg, Alexandra Kollontai, Dora Maria Teles, as I spoke about, those were women that strongly influenced women like myself in the struggle. So I'm going to stop there right now and engage later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zaneria. Just a quick observation. It's funny how the world, the South Africa that we grew up in, you went to high school in Harold Cressy. I was down the road at Cape Town High, and we couldn't have gone to each other's schools. And it was a straight up apartheid context, right, for separate development and separate access to resources. Flash forward to the kind of struggles that young people face today, and I look forward to hearing in terms of the access issues that young people are facing now. Shakil, it's your 5 minutes. It's your platform. Take the mic and share with us some of your insights and experience.
Hi, assalamu alaikum, and good evening to each and every one of you. I am Shakil Garda, and I am inspired by the activism I've merely read about in history books, because of course I was not around to see and witness the things Zaneria mentioned, nor those things that my parents mentioned to me, or anything that any elder really speaks to us about as young people. But I am someone that enjoys listening to the elders speak and to reading history books. And so I am inspired by an event which took place quite early on in our history as South Africans in the 1800s, I think 1886 to be precise, when the Tanabaru Cemetery was closed. That's at the top of Buka, a burial ground for the early Muslims. And I believe there was a plague spreading at the time, and it was believed that all cemeteries close by to people's homes were to be closed to prevent the spread. And we can think of the COVID-19 virus, something similar happening at that time. But the Muslim community insisted that this will not spread because our bodies are buried far beneath the ground, and we will insist that the cemetery remains open. And so, led by Abdul Burns, 3,000 Muslims protested against the closure. And of course, we know that the cemetery remains shut today. But there are many such examples of historical figures, some of whom are forgotten and lay buried beneath the soil, who actually led struggles despite the chains which kept them bound. And I think the times of slavery for us young people is something that we cannot even fathom, because apartheid is something our parents speak about, but nobody can really speak from a point of experience of slavery. And from a Muslim perspective as well, seeing us being able to practice our faith so beautifully, so wonderfully within communities now, where there was a time where this was something clandestine. For me, I'm inspired by the fact that we have these rights today, but that it was not always so, and it was through sacrifices of those old people who remain buried now and almost forgotten, who we should not forget, in fact, that inspire us today. But the time that I live in now is that of being a university student, somebody with decent Wi-Fi, with access to the internet, and witnessing the changing face of activism across the globe, with South Africa being no exception to that. The Peace Must Fall movement having taken place both on the ground as well as online. And many argue that having access to Twitter, for example, allows a very small group of people to know what's going on and to then take those struggles forward. And if those people are not met with actual people on the ground who have no access to these platforms, then are you really changing anything? And I think that's what we ask ourselves today. Are we really making a change, or is it just you and I that both have Twitter, that speak about these things, that cancel each other when we don't agree with one another, where we lose etiquette for one another, that canceling meaning, once you say something out of line, you've gone, you've ruined your reputation. And one has to wonder how effective these tools are today. And so my context is being somebody that was at university and still is during the time of Peace Must Fall, and seeing how a community was polarized by those who were in favor and those who were not in favor. And one can look back and argue whether the means used to convince those who were completely apathetic to the movement of access to education, whether the convincing means were convincing at all, and whether the campus community could have been mobilized a bit better. But we see today that our communities are divided. Some care mostly about struggles that affect people of their own color or of their own creed. Others would be pro certain movements, but not others. And so we see selective activism plaguing our generation today. But I'm sure we will be discussing this quite ahead as the discussion unfolds this evening. But I am one that looks back at history and looks at the days when churches and mosques and schools were used as mobilizing grounds, and how different it is today. But of course, we know the COVID-19 virus came along and forced us to use our phones once again to mobilize around issues of, for example, gender issues, gender-based violence issues, issues of ulama or scholars in the community of Islam using certain words that offended many people, and also asking which issues are we silent about as well. We are, of course, going to be discussing this further this evening, but I don't believe our youth generation is lost. I think we have a lot to gain and to use with this tool of Twitter and Facebook and social media, but a lot of it has to come with maturity, which sometimes we lack, and we need to call each other out, not call each other out, but call each other to account when that happens. And so that's my story.
Thank you, Shakil. And once again, I grew up literally in Military Road, which borders Boerkap and Tamboerskloof, and it was always a strange thing for me that the two communities were so divided. And this is in the 80s, literally by a border. But I'm always fascinated by the story of the Boerkap and the richness of the heritage. Thank you also for raising the issue of social media and its uses, and the echo chamber it can create. I do believe that Umhle will speak about the issues of students coming together, because I think we saw a beautiful moment in 2015 in particular, where students across interest groups and across cultures and identities came together to teach this country a lesson. But my next panelist is Shiham. Shiham, it's your turn to give us 5 minutes. and please do share what inspired you, what sparked your interest in being the activist that you are.
Thank you to Cornerstone and also Martina. It's lovely again just to be and to speak to you and to everybody else on this panel. I think that I was probably straddling after 1994. So with me going to UWC, and I think an important issue for me at that point was the activism that was also at UWC that comes from pre-1994. But I'm going to leave it as that. I think for me, over the past 20 years, I mean, I identify myself as an activist lawyer. And we all know that activism and lawyer historically has not gone together, although many of us believe that our lawyering comes from our activism. So over the past 20 years, I mean, in terms of my litigation that I have done, is that it was inspired by my activism. I see myself as an activist first because the law has always been just a mechanism, a vehicle for social change. And that was always my limited contribution, because my history is that I too, come from Bo-Kaap, and I come historically from a place which is the Scottish Kloof Flats, and we know that the flats in itself was a working class community or an area. And we do know, I mean, within Bo-Kaap in itself, which is a very small community and it's very rich in terms of its culture and the religion, but we also know that there is also a lot of challenges around class, and there is issues around patriarchy and how women are also on the one hand perceived. So that is my upbringing. And so all the issues that Zanaria has brought in terms of the things pre-1994 that have come into, the poor working class communities, in terms of activism, which is, for example, the UDF, etc. I was one of those children that attended school, that went, that was during the time of the 80s, a state of emergency. So that is what informed me. So being a lawyer at the end of the day was just, for me, a mechanism to ensure that people are given rights that I saw was taken away from our people in my limited way. So in addition to that what has also pushed me, and one of my areas of besides gender, but areas of litigation, is land and housing. And that was fundamentally because my grandmother, as everybody knows, lived in Leeuwen Street. And I could never understand, and I didn't know what was the term gentrification at the time. And I only started knowing what that is when I did my articles at the Legal Resource Center. And in addition to that, when I met people like the late Anwar Nagia, and also currently the chairperson of the Bo-Kaap Civic Association. And I know that Zanaria has spoken about the New Unity Movement, etc. My road literally is Voetboeg. And it runs into Bloem Street, which that is where the late Mr. and Keys lived. And so I was drawn into, not on high-level political discussions, but as a young 14, 15-year-old, to be able to do, for example, plays, etc., and awareness. So that's my history. And so moving out of that particular history, which is a civic background, I moved into, going to UWC. My first preference was actually to be a social worker. But my dad said, there's no way I'm going to be a social worker because I'm going to bring everybody in the house. So rather choose law. And going to UWC was a natural university, for me to go to because of its history. My parents, at the end of the day, I mean, the working class, mother clerk, father bricklayer. At the end of the day, we had to, get the funds from the NSFIS. And then in addition to that, I ended up, also getting married at the age of 19. So you can see the intersections. When I call myself an intersectional feminist, it is not just in terms of theory. It is actually the intersections of, living in a community which is predominantly a Muslim community, predominantly also working class, predominantly where I come from, which is the flats, which historically did not own their property. And that at that time, the flats people, what they call, who did not even have a vote within the civic. So it is to be able to push an agenda and to ensure that there's voice. So just coming back to where does my feminism come from, is that historically, I mean, my activism is not separate from my feminism, because what I have also seen within my community, which is something that we do not speak about, is issues around gender-based violence, the challenges that people face in terms of the lack of empowerment of women, the lack of agency. And I'm not saying that women within our communities don't have complete agency, but what we don't see is that we don't see those women in, for example, leadership roles. And what I have always committed myself to is to be able to ensure that women are center, women have voice, whether or not it's in the community, whether or not it's in the home, or whether or not it's in your mosque, or whether or not it's your church, whatever structure. And because I strongly believe in the equality of sexes, I believe in the eradication of sexism and also misogyny. And that is what actually pushed me to be able to do the work that I am doing. And so on some level, people will also ask, but now how are you a feminist and that you are Muslim? I do not see myself separate, because equality is center to everything that we do, whether or not, and there is no, it is not, I'm not going to say that I'm a feminist, for example, a Muslim, because that requires a very particular, it's a very particular activism or that those women are doing. But I do see myself as a feminist, and I do see myself as a Muslim, and I do see myself as a woman. And I think, and also in addition to that, I see myself as South African, and I see myself as Black. That in itself brings all my activism, my intersectional feminism to the core in terms of the work that we do. So when I speak about litigation, it is very important for me to be able to ensure that the lived realities of our people are brought before the court. Why? Because the court is also a center of patriarchy. And how do we bring about that particular change? But thank you, Natina. I've noted in terms of access to justice and to be able to ensure that the voices of women are centered in all decisions that we make. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You haven't changed a bit. You still spit fire. And I hope we all do. The next panelist is Umhle. And as we invite Umhle to share her first 5 minutes, I want to direct one particular question to you, which maybe you'll touch now, maybe a bit later. But it's really, how does your generation view ours? I mean, we'll go into it in a bit more detail, but did you feel at the point of 2015, did you feel like you had been betrayed by us who had been the pushing force towards change in this country? But over to you.
That's a very good question, Martina. It's very interesting that we are having this conversation a week before Fees Must Fall actually kicked off 5 years ago at Wits University on the 6th of October with the Workers' Solidarity Strike. And during that time of activism, just to answer your question, Martina, what I really did feel coming from the two generations was a disconnect, especially within our activist networks. And this disconnect, I think it came with, there was not enough co-leadership and peer learning from each other in order for us to actually understand that activism is not stagnant. Activism also does not happen in isolation. And I think working with workers at that time and with our lecturers, our university staff who were very supportive of our movement really assisted within those gaps. But there were moments of confusion when it came to the generation that were in political parties or any form of authority at that time that had the power to change things. And I guess when you are a student at that time, you come in with a particular type of consciousness and you come out also with a particular type of consciousness. And I think that consciousness for me now has matured from the time of 2015 as we were very young in our early 20s through the direction of Shara Kala, who was our president at that time, And Fees Must Fall for me was just along the journey of my activism. It did not start there. And as everyone has spoken their story, for me, activism really started within my family. My parents really instilled the attributes and the characteristics of being a servant to our community at all times. And I think before I came to university, my mother had bought me a book. It was written by one of an anthropologist that I like, Carol Baskin from not Carol Baskin, sorry, Carol Hunter. And the book was The Anthropology of Feminism. And my mom was introducing me to feminism. A long time she had not allowed me to read those books, but a year before I came to university, I started delving into books about feminism, books about class, about race. And when I got to university, reality hit that there were so many people who were living under different systems of oppression, different systems that were really stopping them from living a very dignified life. We weren't really getting equitable education throughout all our universities. You had students who would be in class, but still have to worry about accommodation, still have to worry about fees. And from there, I joined student movements on my campus, religious and political movements. And I started learning how important it was for me to participate in my environment, not only just as a student with my academics, but take my academics outside of the classroom and actually practice my convictions, practice the things that I'm learning in my class. And that's when I got involved very deeply within my student movements. And I then decided to run for SRC. And when running for SRC, it was a very tough time. This is when NAFSIS as a whole was collapsing. As a system, it wasn't really working in our universities, and we really had a tough time getting our students back into university because of funding, not because students weren't doing well in their schoolwork or in their academics. These students were excellent, but the problem was access. And access became then our priority as that SRC of 2015. From the beginning of the year, we didn't only start our protest action at the end of the year, but from the beginning of the year, January 16 was our first protest. Throughout 2015, our priority continually was access. And then when it came to we came to a point where we saw that we weren't being heard. We weren't being heard within our university structures. We weren't being heard by our governments. We weren't being heard even within our political parties that we were part of. And our SRC said enough is enough. We cannot be having the same conversations every year, having the same type of protest every year. We need to do something that will really shake up the system, that will really also feed into bringing real change for the students coming after us. And this is when Fees Must Fall was birthed on the 2nd of September 2015 by Shara Kala, myself, and Nompendulo at the time. And just to go back to points that were made again, that students have always been at the center of mobilizing against socio-economic justices within our country through different moments of history. But women have also been at the forefront. And I think at this time, Fees Must Fall, social media really helped us to take back that narrative, of being erased from history, being erased from our stories, being erased from a participation that has been built on such a rich history. And that's when the birth of Fees Must Fall came, but the birth of also a hashtag generation. And it's been quite a journey. It's still a journey that we are all still part of. Each and every one of us of that SRCU partook in building Fees Must Fall, and what Fees Must Fall is today is still an activist in their own rights, in their own vocations. And but we are still in a fight with connecting with the older generation, but also raising up a generation that is going to continue beyond the hashtag generation, because there's still so much work to be done within our spaces. I'll just end it there for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Omhle. And so now you've been introduced to our extraordinary panelists. The next area of focus would be, remember this panel is about the intergenerational dialogue, and I'm very interested to find out how leaders and activists with a kind of rich background that Zenaria and Shiham have felt about Fees Must Fall and this new generation of activism. Did we see it coming, ladies? And do you think that we did enough? And by we, I mean those of us who are from the pre-94 activism era. And the role of media within that, how you perceived the media to be used in that, in those moments. How do you feel about that scenario? Maybe you first.
So Fees Must Fall was preceded by Roads Must Fall at UCT. And it was then that, the whole issue of decolonized education arose. Intersectionalism was a big word at the time. And a meeting was actually organized with some of the activists of the Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, the group of activists from UCT and other campuses in the Cape. With some of us from the 80s generation, we actually had one meeting where we discussed what they spoke to us about how they saw things, and we sort of, as I suppose the elders or the older generation in the room had an engagement with them around our experiences and our excitement at the fact that after a long sort of hiatus with no sort of serious struggle at student level, students were active again and questioning things which we hadn't dealt with at the time that we were activists. And what I'm going to say now is that I make no apology for our activism at that time. You do what you do, with what you know, when you are there. So that is, hindsight is always a perfect science. When you are in the situation and you're engaged with your comrades and your fellow students or your community, because I went from being a student activist to being an activist in one of the first people, the youngest board member in 1981, the United Women's Organization was formed in the Cape once again. And a lot of the Federation of South African Women, ANC Women's League, were the sort of leadership which we as 18-year-olds were engaging with. And we learned from them, and they may have felt they hadn't gone far enough, but we weren't there to critique. We appreciated the lessons, and in our context, that was what we did. And of course, when I say this, we didn't do it in a sort of homogenous way. There were struggles, there were conflicts, even amongst activists around strategy, tactics, the way we should approach things, etc. But I definitely feel that we need to learn from previous generations. We can critique it, but we can only critique it with hindsight. We don't know what we would have done if we were in the 60s or the 50s or the 40s or wherever we were. So unless there were actual informers or people sold out, as we can speak about in relation to post-94, in relation to many activists going into positions of power and what happened in relation to that, one can't, in my view, we can be criticized, but we did what we could with what we had at the time. Thanks.
No, thanks, Zenaria. Fair enough. Shiham, did you bail a whole lot of young people out in 2015, 2016? I mean, what was your role, and how did you feel as a young person that's more mature dealing with this youth?
I have to admit, Martina, because I was literally straddling between. it was very difficult because my older comrades that were sitting in the, for example, structures like National Association of Democratic Lawyers, the Zanaria most probably know that most probably bailed all of them out, was much more defensive also around the gains that have been made in terms of our constitution as well as the struggle. So you had to literally balance between that and me also understanding that I have a 25-year-old and a 15-year-old that completely believe in, for example, the hashtag movement at the time. And, the changes that have been brought, for example, not just by fees must fall, roads must fall, because subsequently we all know there was the total shutdown movement. And to be able to ensure. So I think it was critical for me to be able to just step back. And that is where our activism, your activism steps in. To be able to say that your role as a lawyer is to be a lawyer. And I think Zanaria will be able to understand that. Although we are sitting within a rights-based and a constitutional framework, lawyers need to understand their positionality in terms of their privilege, in terms of their class, and that goes also even for students that are sitting at university. Because one thing that I have seen during this particular period was that it goes back to grassroots movements again. Grassroots movements and what movements look like. Whether or not you can look at the decentralized type of lack of leadership, which is sitting within the fees must fall, which sits in total shutdown in terms of roads must fall. And then you see, I would sadly say, Zanaria, there was a lot of good work, obviously, within structures like the UDF and structures, in terms of political movements, etc. But we also know it is a very militaristic way of operation, and there was also not a space for other. So within those structures, because there was a very particular goal. So I believe strongly in a hybrid. The hybrid is to be able to find the level between, because even with a hashtag, even with social movement, you need to be informed by a political, there must be a political philosophy. You cannot do this work without understanding, for example, the broader challenges of capitalism, of white monopoly, of patriarchy that is center in relation to all the things that we are doing. So just coming back, Martina, I do think that there needs to be an intersection between understanding what our roles were, like Zanaria has indicated, but also where do we find the balance? Because the one thing about the social media is also, it has now given voice. It is a space that you can recreate. And sometimes we can also say that it's a space which can be genderless, because it's a space where some of us will be able to say it's a space for women to be able to reclaim spaces and to be able to push back in terms of cultural and stereotypical, not just processes within the community. So it's a new space, but it must still be informed by a political underpinning or whatever that might be for that particular person, because it can't be separate. And so how do we find that balance between, because for me to continuously bail students out, we also need to understand that, yes, they are using their privilege, but what does that mean if it was a person on the ground that is being arrested at the end of the day? It means that that person is losing their job. It means a woman cannot feed. It means many things. So it's good to be able to use your privilege to be able to push an agenda. But ultimately, it is active citizenry. It is where we need to go to. Because the one challenge that we have also, just not just as lawyers and also as civil society, is that we become the voice of the people on the ground. And we need to understand that we are not that. How do we ensure that communities reclaim their self-respect? People at the end of the day reclaim their power and also the ability to restructure their own power relations within their particular communities. And that for me is activism. So whether or not it's done through social media or even whether or not it's done through the courts, it has the same principles. It's about power and how do we shift power to the communities and the people that we serve.
Thank you, Siham. I think people are receiving your engagement well, your input well. Shakil, challenge us a bit here on the use of social media as an expression of activism. I mean, I think again during the Fees Must Fall era, we saw two parts of that movement. The first part presented itself as a very diverse, very politically not homogenous movement. There were student activists from all different political parties, from all persuasions, including non-politically active people, young people coming together around a common cause. And there was a strong solidarity with workers and workers' issues, which interestingly enough echoed the student movement of the 80s and early 90s as well. There was always that intersectionality, even though we didn't know that word intersectionality, but on the basis of class, race, gender, I mean, that was the analysis at the time. What are your impressions? I mean, you made a comment earlier that the Twitter sphere can be quite caustic, can be quite an echo chamber, the cancel culture, but can it be effective for advocacy? Can communities use these tools to advocate? And what's the role of young people in sparking the fire, lighting the fire for society? Just unmute yourself, Shakil.
Yeah, I think, I'll reiterate what I said earlier, that to be on social media means that you have some smartphone or the other, that you have data to access that discussion, and that you also sort of know who to follow and people follow you, and how that happens, could be because you're big mouth and people like that, or your use of language appeals to more than just a few people. Or you come from a university like myself in Onkledu, where people tend to listen to Vitsies more than others, and I hate that word Vitsie. But anyway, besides that, I think that there is, of course, potential in advocacy via social media. I think when with the incident which took place last year with Uyinene in the Cape, suddenly it became a national discussion around gender-based violence, around people speaking up about their fears of going to places like the post office, being at university, being young and having ambitions for the future. And we know since then till today, not much has changed factually, but I think that the national community has come closer, with women particularly speaking up about their own experiences, and men having to listen and understand that there is a genuine and sincere fear around being at university, being far from home, leaving your family to go and study in a big city, and having to navigate that space while still being fearful of people that are meant to be your allies. So I don't think social media is completely handicapped with respect to creating a movement online that also translates into real life behavior, because now in real life we know that if somebody looks to be troubled in person in real life, we are aware that through social media that something really is at play here, and this person does potentially need our help, and we should heed their call. Whereas had the discussion not happened online, many people would not be privy to those discussions, because perhaps their families are either silent about it, or it hasn't happened to their friends, or they just happen to live in a bubble, or be in the library all the time and not, socializing among students, which is a reality. I wouldn't say that Fees Must Fall was ever something that was not homogenous. I think there were always many people that were not part of it from the onset, and that was due to class divides. And I think the movement itself tried to get people on board who were of privileged class, and this idea of privilege came. The word privilege then started to gain currency even among our generation at the time, calling those who complained about their holidays being taken away or their vehicles being parked at campus overnight out for complaining about things which really didn't speak to the bread and butter issues that students were facing, having nowhere to sleep at night but for the campus libraries, or having no means of paying their fees, for example. So, university is that place where people from all backgrounds come and sit in the same classroom, no questions asked about how you got there. And social media is another place where we can speak and chat. But I'm not confident that the advocacy happening online is enough. I will say that from a small community perspective, a lot of noise can be made around issues such as the elders being the upper echelons of patriarchal Islamic society, for example, which Shiham alluded to earlier, where recently one of our scholars used a video to speak about polygamy. And so we saw people mobilizing around that issue, but that isn't happening enough, on social media from older or young people. I think there's so many other issues as well that we're completely sidelining and ignoring. We aren't using the potential that the social media tool has, but we are forgetting, as I will say again, the many people who have zero access to Twitter, to Facebook, to Instagram, who are living real tough lives out there, and we aren't reaching them because some of us feel that our thumbs are doing the work, and the term activism then comes to the fore. So I'm not saying it's doomsday. I'm saying there is hope for social media, but clearly not enough is being done in real life.
Thank you, Shakil. I mean, I think you raise important points about not putting all one's expectations on social media to be an expression of activism. Activism is not about the hashtag tweet, although it's useful for mobilizing. Definitely getting out there and doing things is what's required. Action from activist. An activist is someone who takes action. We weren't going to armchair revolutionaries of the I mean, there's been armchair revolutionaries throughout history, but I mean, I think social media revolutionaries don't impress me too much. Omhle, to you, I want to press you a bit more. I mean, I think the two legacy things that we've learned from the moment in South Africa's history where fees must fall, roads must fall, and so forth emerged was this better understanding of systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic prejudice, and then what Shakil alluded to. I forgot the word now. I'm a terrible facilitator, Shakira, but basically an analysis of society that shows that 25 years, 26 years into newfound democracy, it's not so much, although that's also very important, kind of interpersonal racism or gender-based issues or whatever, but actually how our systems haven't transformed enough to be equitable towards all of the citizens. I mean, how do you see the future? I mean, who's going to be the next Fees Must Fall generation for you? And what is our role as those represented on the panel, in preparing the way for those students? What is our generational responsibility as mothers and your side as young people now emerging from a student movement going into society? Your mic is muted.
Thank you for that question, Martina. I think one of the things for me that's been really, as I said, going into Fees Must Fall, I went in with a different type of consciousness, and coming out, I came out with a different type of consciousness as well. And just to go back to Shahima's point of ideology and philosophy, that for me has been one of my core songs that I keep on singing around my generation, is that we cannot move any movement forward without a particular ideology. We need to be grounded on a foundation that is strong, and a foundation that remembers that justice must be served at the end of the day, not just at any cost, because the people, the environment that we are in, the social environments, our communities, citizens, there's a lot at stake, and there's a lot of people who are going to be affected and impacted by our decisions that we make. As much as Fees Must Fall was great in the public eye, there were a lot of consequences that came with being part of the movement, but the movement in itself, where a lot of students got excluded because things did not change. Because what we missed, I think, as our generation, is that structure was what we are supposed to target, not really the short-term goals that come with our movement or with our demands. It was all great and good that we wanted to address the immediate and the urgent, but I don't think we really thought through about the long-term goals of what education should look like, what access should look like. and how education also feeds into other social parts of our nations as well. And I think for me, what I always reiterate around my activist spaces is that activism as a discourse and a space should not reflect the type of systems that we want to demolish. So the power dynamics that are found within activism spaces, even with the power dynamics that social media creates, because you now find that there are particular leaders that are now being praised over other leaders, and this loss of a collective story gets lost in the space. And even though social media has become this public archive, but the story is still very centralized, narrative is still very centralized, representation is also still very centralized. And for me, I think the fees must fall, or generation that's coming next, or the hashtag generation that's coming next, is a hashtag generation that must be conscious of their privilege, conscious of their position. Because as much as our youth engagement was all over social media, was all over the news, there is a youth movement in Northern KZN that till today has still not gotten media attention or even attention from governments. And that is problematic. And those are the hard conversations that our youth must engage in and talk about. Those are the hard conversations that our youth must come to admission to, and say there is a problem in how we use social media for particular struggles and for particular people of class. And I think it's very important for us to continually keep ourselves in check as activists, keep ourselves in check as people who are in a position to access such platforms. As Shakil said, social media, you need data, you need this, you need that. And for me, I believe that social media can be very, very exclusive when it comes to languaging, where someone may not even feel comfortable in sharing a comment about their community in their own language at the fear of being looked at as somebody who's backward, at the fear of looking at somebody who's not using these words as intersectionality. And there should be translation, goes back to heritage and culture. There should be funding that is given for that type of translation, that type of contentization that should be happening, education that is more decentralized and more accessible to people in other spaces besides the metropolitan spaces. And I think it's very important for us as activists to continue this work of education. And I don't think the work of an activist stops at just a movement, stops at just that moment of history. It's a long time. Until you go to the grave, you should continue being an activist in every space you are in, educating, continue to educate yourself as well. Just take that step back and look at what's in front of you. And I think the next coming generation, it's going to be very important for them to lay down that foundation that is inclusive, lay down a foundation that has platform and opens up space for hard conversations to be had, and not these conversations that are just surface level, but for hard conversations to be had. Because leadership is not easy as well. That is a conversation that is not spoken about enough in society. Leadership is not easy as well. There are always so many things that you need to take into consideration. And I think our generation must always understand that it's not only just our struggle that is hard. There are so many other struggles of older generations that are still hard. And I think taking into consideration both or all these tensions that are happening in society is imperative and very important for the next coming generation.
Thank you, Umhle. At this point, I'm just going to quickly, while we digest the input, going to read a few comments because we have quite a vibrant chat session with our viewers. So I just wanted to, Pejamaru Stoic says, I sincerely sympathize with Umhle on the point of our activist maturity has developed. For the early 90s generation in particular, Fees Must Fall was the first real interaction with physical and practical activism for us as a collective. I just want to agree with that comment. I'll never forget October 21 at the South African National Parliament. Sorry, this is my comment. And I just want to share this. And I was an official in the Parliament administration at the time. And 2015 was that terrible year, which started with signal jammers and kind of continued with bouncers, and then so as a parliamentary official, we were at the front line of viewing all these occurrences. And then when the young people came, the students, I'll never forget that day. I went outside as the tires were burning outside the Botha statue, and the students hadn't entered yet. And it was such a poignant moment, you know, just to realize how angry and how determined and how motivated this generation was. It was really a turning point for me. And I will own it. I mean, I did feel like we let our guard down, my generation, a bit, in the good faith of the first 20 years of democracy. We let our guard down a little bit. So the second comment from Nazima Mohammed: did we not get too complacent as we aged? I think this is my my feeling a little bit, and I think it's a historical lesson for us. On that point of Shyam, how do we normalize conditioning activism citizenship in our various social institutions, families and schools? That's a good question, Shyam, maybe for you to address, Zenario, anyone else. Do we do enough civic education? That's the question. Do we understand how government works? Do we understand how parliament works? Do we understand how Chapter 9 and 10 institutions work enough to invoke our citizenship rights? We live in a bifocal context. If you look at how Mamdani describes a post-colonial country, you know, how are we dealing with the rural-urban divide in terms of activism, in terms of the kinds of issues that Umhle raised? Akila Hendrickse, thank you for your question, your comment. Can you maybe touch on the current state of NSFAS as they have unfunded students? I think, Umhle, you spoke about that a little bit, or referred to that. The problems aren't solved. And the problem is, unless you correct the institutional challenges, the year by year, the issues get perpetuated. Which bears the question, did we reform or did we transform? You know, I think with any country that's going through the kind of change that South Africa has experienced in the last 30 years, one has to choose. Does one reform? Does one transform? Or does one burn down and rebuild? You know, and I think for South Africa, there would be an argument that says we've done too much reformation and not enough transformation. But I'll throw that spice to the floor. And then Renee Ngwenya, watching the Zondo Commission sessions, I'm so conscious of the stark lessons glaring in our faces and the need for continued activism in a post-struggle landscape. The same with men who stood on elevated platforms during the struggle for justice, yet they become abusers in a democracy. These contradictions are fatal when positive peace becomes a non-reachable attainment. Hope our younger generations could learn from what did not go too well from us. And that's a beautiful statement to round off some of the comments we're getting. Who would like to tackle some of these comments? Zenaria?
Did we get too complacent? So I think I'm going to take a longer way to answer this. I think context is very important in relation to when one discusses the activism of, say, the activism of recent and what needs to happen today. Because there's not enough of activism in the sense of challenging in terms of what Renee is speaking about here, what we're seeing, right? And the context, I suppose, was we had a very particular goal. We had an apartheid state, which was very repressive, very violent. Many of my comrades were detained, killed, disappeared. And that was the context which we faced. We had states of emergency. My younger brother, for example, in 1985, as he was matriculating, they didn't write that year, lost a year of high school. So those were the kinds of maybe minor sacrifices, because those who lost their lives, like Ashley Creel and Anton Franch and Colleen Williams and Robert Waterwich, and I'm just using some of the activists who lost their lives when they were 20. They didn't even have time to really become young, 20s, 30s, 40s, which we have enjoyed. That was the context of our activism at the time, hiding, sort of banned material which we had to smuggle. But we didn't have the social media tools of that time. In fact, in 1986, when I first was introduced to email, it was amazing because we could then communicate faster in relation to, say, a meeting that needed to happen. We didn't have to do the Bush Telegraph, the phone calls, etc., the pamphleteering, the house visits, etc., that we had to do as activists. But the repression was quite critical. And I think when our democracy was a negotiated settlement, and I think that's important to understand. It wasn't a revolutionary overthrow of the government of the time. It was a negotiated settlement. And that negotiated settlement contributed to demobilizing, in a way. We thought now democracy, which we have been focused on, which we have been fighting for, it's here. Our comrades are going into government, things are going to change, etc. So, of course, and Mandela was our first president. We had such high regard for Mandela, who was a symbol and a mobilizing symbol for us, as well as others. And of course, you then comes the arms deal, right? Comes the arms deal as the first thing that one starts thinking, what's going on here? Many activists in government start leaving government. They cannot, in fact, be there because the power struggles are starting to happen. The corruption is beginning to get entrenched. Not that corruption begins at this point. Corruption essentially has been there, and those who were clever enough connected with the ones that came after in post 94, made connections, etc. So as to keep that. There are many books that have been published recently which show how those connections got made with some activists, some people who were in the struggle, etc. BEE, I was in a BEE organization for many years. And eventually, 2 years ago, I felt I cannot find comfort any longer in a corporate environment in relation to activism, because how can one basically, do that? But we were demobilized because we were hopeful at the time. And then, as I said, there were various struggles that punctuated that period at local levels, but it never took off on a national level. And even now, we don't have a sustained movement against the kind of abuses and corruption that is happening in our democracy currently. So this is quite important when I look at René's comment. What are we going to do now? What are all of us going to do now about what's happening in the country? We also feel, many of us, that we've been sold out, and many people stopped. They just disengaged completely. So disillusioned, so very disillusioned they were. So I think, there's always context. And I agree with Oomshle in the sense of one needs a framework. You need tools of analysis. You need ideology. You cannot just rush out onto the street, because where is Fees Must Fall now? What's happened with that movement? So unless you have built strong, solid organization, social media is a tool. Like we had pamphlets, social media is a more fast-working, effective tool in relation to getting your message out. We used to have to go knock on a door and drop a pamphlet, make a phone call. Now you can do it one time on a WhatsApp group, through Facebook, through Twitter, but it also has I've disengaged from social media, quite frankly, because one feels that one is compelled to engage all the time. So I'm off all forms of social media since the beginning of 2019, and I don't miss it at all. So for me, it's an important tool, but one must know it's a tool. It's not the struggle itself. And as to the complacency, which is the original question, yes, I think there is that, but I think one must understand what actually happened, as I've tried to explain with regard. And many of my comrades have died in the last 2-3 years, my age, and we've been coming together at their funerals, etc. Many of them died poor and disillusioned, and that's just been a tragic thing to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaneria. Before I go to Shyam, Omkle and Shakil, the fees must fall, and you guys also faced quite a robust state security onslaught, which included lawfare or kind of warfare in the online space. So social media, Twitter and so forth, Facebook, we've seen can become sites of new struggle. Just like Zaneria was talking about the pamphleteering, the posters. When I edited a student newspaper in the early 90s or late 80s, it was censored physically. But you guys faced a different kind of onslaught. One with sinister campaigns, state security, kind of bullying students, co-opting students. So you've had a taste of what can go horribly wrong in a society if we're not vigilant. What are your lessons learned from that, and what kind of awareness do you carry forward in understanding that media is a tool, but it's not activism in and of itself? I don't know which one of you wants to take it, Shakil or Omkle.
Okay, I'll take that question. I think for one of the lessons that we really learned is that training on how to use these tools is very important, especially for younger generations, because sometimes with social media can be easy for us to get carried away. It also can be very easy for us to be infiltrated if we're not a unit and we all don't have the same understanding of what type of message and narrative we are all trying to display on our social media. And I think with organizations on our campus, they really tried to have that that particular type of training. But as I'm saying again, it was too centralized. And then you then had state security with their counter messaging on social media, media outlets, communication media houses as well, and trying to counter such a huge machine with very limited resources was quite difficult. And I always encourage the leaders that we're training now, whether they are in rural settings or in the metropoles as well, is to try their best to continue with the training, but also never forget when raising funds to also understand that to use social media to a point where it's relevant for them in their messaging, but also it really speaks to their story, the core of their story. Because I do believe that empathy from society comes with the authenticity of what you guys are trying to actually express. And when you have too many voices, it's easier for the enemy to come in and then divide and conquer. So those are one of the things that we are really trying to recuperate again with our team as well, when it comes to just training our leaders to be more efficient with the tools that as activists they can use to carry their struggles forward. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got 12 minutes left. So panelists, we're going to go into closing statements now. Thank you. It's been a great, rich conversation so far. Maybe any last minute thoughts before we go towards a close? Shyam, maybe let's start with you.
Yes, thank you, Martina. I think it's I just want to say that it's a false dichotomy to say that the then and now is different, because if you see what Zenaria just said and Omsley said around the infiltration, for example, of the state, the infiltration happened during the struggle, whether or not it was and it was done in different forms. I mean, and we know how that was done. And then also during the social media. But I think that is why it's important to be able to understand the lessons, both from the past, to be able to inform the future. And how do we do that? But I think also with the current social media and also hashtag generation, it is also an opportunity, because like I said before, I'm straddling. And to be able to see that, for example, we had the hashtag Me Too, we have the hashtag We Believe Her, we have all of those, and to be able to give again, voice to women, voice to the voiceless. And I think that for me is important. Whatever we do, we need to be able to support the existing struggles of our people, whether or not it's through the court or whether or not it's through social media. Maybe something else will come after this, which is the Generation Z. Which is where my 15-year-old is sitting, which they believe that the Fees Must Fall movement is just a tired movement. And the issue, how do we inform all of these particular struggles? Because it cannot be divorced from the people on the ground. It cannot. And also, in addition to that, when we talk about movements, I'm not talking about civil society created movements. I'm talking about real movements that come from our communities, that is situated within that community in terms of the needs and the struggles. And that is where we all understand our particular roles. And I think that is very important in terms of those that is pre-1994 and also those after 1994. Because the one comment this is the last thing that I just want to say, the comment that first, there's a real interaction with physical and practical activism post-1994, which is the Fees Must Fall. I think that is also false, because we all know that during the 90s, the 2000s, we have seen the socioeconomic challenges of our people. The only issue is that there was no platform to be able to show those particular challenges. So we missed something, and what we have missed is that we have missed the challenges again of our people. And what does that look like? And how do we support it? Thank you, Martina.
Thank you. Shakil, any thoughts from you? Last thoughts?
I'm just, quite taken aback by this idea that the past is not really the past. It seeps into the present, and so we to the future. And I think for all people that use social media who may be listening to this, we need to use it as that tool that was mentioned, as an educational tool. I've heard many people tell me that they come from families where these things aren't discussed, where politics is taboo, and that they've learned so much and transformed their brains and minds to understand what the national picture looks like thanks to social media. And just to do away with cancel culture and to walk the talk that you tweet and that you use your thumbs for, because it cannot end there. It cannot end at 140 characters. It needs to go beyond that. And so for myself and for people like myself who are on there, who use it for good that we think is good, it's building social cohesion. You're finding people that come from different backgrounds, getting to know one another, and from there, I suppose, can mobilize in future towards real struggles beyond university campuses, something else that will crop up certainly in future, whether it's a gender struggle or a economic struggle or political struggle. Us getting to know one another and bridging those gaps is quite important right now. But etiquette is very important, and avoiding slacktivism and avoiding cancel culture, I think for me, is paramount to the success of social media as a mobilizing tool for activism for the future. And
thank you, Shakil. Omhle, any last thoughts from you? Any words to share?
Just my last thoughts. For me, I believe that intergenerational platforms like these are very important because it's so good for us to continue to learn, especially as the younger generation. I know I'm throwing them under the bus, but we have a problem with being teachable. And I think it's one thing that we really need to attack because it's unacceptable to not want to learn. It's unacceptable to also not want to understand context. And I think with political action comes then with what Sahima and Zanera are talking about is understanding the context, understanding what happened in order for us to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistake and we don't lead our people astray as well. And I think it's very important for us to continue these conversations and also just come in and with all our intergenerational tensions and have these hard conversations as we've been having today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Omkle. Zaneria, last words from you.
So I suppose it's to end with two quotes before I say something. These are just quotes I found in sort of thinking about today. The one was a quote by Alice Walker, which was, "Activism is the rent we pay for living on this planet." So generally, it must be an activity which comes from your very soul, your being, your commitment. It's not something that you get paid for. And then the other quote, which makes me think of activists and our, not only in South Africa, but across the world. It actually comes from the movie Batman, The Dark Knight. And any of you who love Batman movies would identify with the character Harvey Dent, where he says, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And when Chris Hani was assassinated on April the 10th of that particular year, I think it was 1991 or 90, he died a hero.
It was 93's area.
Was it 93? But he died a hero, right? It was before our democratic election. And when Mugabe died last year, for many of us who he had been an inspiration to in the 80s, he died a villain. So I think we're going to find the same situation with activists who had given much of their lives in the 80s and so on. Many of them may very well die villains. And I hope that none of us will die as villains and not necessarily die as heroes either, but make sure that we continue wherever we are, every place that we are is a site for struggle. There are new struggles. There are, for example, socio-ecological struggles. We didn't look at the environmental issues when we were, those are big struggles now. Disability, the various struggles that come up now are different. But once again, they're all connected by a system that essentially gives rise to all these inequalities and fractures and breaks in our society. We can't necessarily tackle each and every element of it, but we do need to understand how everything is basically connected to the other. So we can't, when someone is busy, say, with on Palestine, and we want to say, no, what about the animals? Or what about the rhinos? We can't get it. They're all connected to each other, whether it's Palestine and whether it's the rhinos, or whether it's what the ecology and the planet and oil and all these various things that we see. And it's universal. So while we act locally where we are, whether, as Shiam pointed out, it's in our community, in the street where we are, because we're dealing with maybe a gender-based issue, to have that context and that understanding and that framework is important so that we approach these things with a way which doesn't cause and create division amongst peoples on the grounds of race and so on. and become insular and narrow in our approach. We have to have the kind of thinking which is open, which is progressive, and we need to act where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Zanir, and what powerful words to end off on. We're in the last minute, so I'd like to say thank you very much to these 4 powerful panelists. Good luck for everything that you're doing. I know that all 5 of us consider the work that we do as our sites of struggle, as well as our social and other interactions. I think once you have that activist in you, it's hard to get rid of. So hopefully we'll meet again when we're a bit older and grey, Omkle and Shakil, when you guys have older kids like us and have to face your own truths, you know, when the next generation rises up. Thank you very much, Shakira, for inviting all of us. I know I played a role in facilitating, but really, I mean, it was just to share the mic around the virtual table. So thank you very much for this visionary series. Thank you very much to Cornerstone Institute for inviting us into your space. I hope it's been useful, and may the debates continue, and may this work that we do continue. Thank you very much.